So, welcome everyone to the Hagen History Center and our speaker series. Tonight is the second of three lectures featuring the topic of Frank Lloyd Wright. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to invite you to visit us at our beautiful campus at 356 West 6th Street in Erie. We have 20 professionally designed exhibit galleries, including the Frank Lloyd Wright Aaron Green San Francisco office. We are open Tuesdays through Sundays for visitation. Please see our website for further information. That's eriehistory.org, eriehistory.org, or follow us on Facebook. So tonight's speaker, his subject is the San Francisco office in the architectural practice of Frank Lloyd Wright. His name is Charles Rosenblum. Charles is a journalist, critic, and scholar writing about architecture, art, and other aspects of visual culture. As an academic, he taught history and theory of architecture at Carnegie Mellon and other institutions in Western Pennsylvania for 20 years. As a writer, his work has appeared regularly in publications including the Pittsburgh City Paper, Next Pittsburgh, and the Pittsburgh Quarterly, earning numerous awards. He has written for national outlets, including Architectural Record, Architects Newsletter, Preservation, and the Frank Lloyd Wright Quarterly. He's been a regular contributor to books and publications in the Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation, a recently broadcast television documentary, Henry Hornbostel in Architecture and Legacy, was based on Charles's architectural dissertation on the architect and featured him as an on-screen expert. The recent reconstruction and exhibition of Frank Lloyd Wright's San Francisco office, the Hagen History Center in Erie, PA, brings new visibility to the topic of Charles' master's thesis on that very project. As a graduate of Yale University, Charles earned both his MAH and PhD degrees from the University of Virginia. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce and turn the program over to Charles Rosenblum. Charles?
George, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be part of this series, delighted to participate with the Hagen History Center. I'd like to thank you and all of the staff at the Hagen History Center, including Pam Parker and others. I owe a special debt of gratitude to Jeff Kidder, the architect of the building and the reinstallation of the San Francisco office, and really so much more. Thanks to Jeff Kidder for bringing me in to participate in this project, and thanks, of course, to Tom Hagen for his philanthropy and vision. Thank you to all involved. I'm sure I'm leaving out critical people, but I'm delighted to be here and to have this opportunity. I'm delighted to talk about Frank Lloyd Wright and related projects because it continues to be a passion of mine, and I find that it's easy to bring others into that enthusiasm, and really that's what I'm here to do. And I want to do it through the magic of this PowerPoint presentation. So let's see here. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to select the PowerPoint, and that should allow me to view the slideshow. Okay, all right, here we go. The San Francisco office in the architectural practice of Frank Lloyd Wright at the Hagen History Center, and people at home watching Facebook Live. Thank you, everybody. Strictly educational purposes, any images are implemented under fair use provisions. This is an educational lecture, and I'm delighted that people are here for it. 40 minutes of commentary, something like that. It's divided into 10 sections just to keep the pace going. I need not read through these, but you'll see the little list as we go through, and that helps understand how we're progressing. I'm going to talk about Frank Lloyd Wright's career, how he worked in offices of different kinds, why Aaron Green and the San Francisco office were simultaneously extraordinary, but also really coming out of the circumstance of how Frank Lloyd Wright ran his studios and ran his practices. And also we'll look at some of the extraordinary figures involved in those. Aaron Green was unique, but he had colleagues and people who did things that were kind of related. I always like to start with why we revere Frank Lloyd Wright. Looking at this picture of the Martin House in beautiful Buffalo, this is an apogee of prairie-style architecture from the early 20th century. Something like the Roby House in Chicago is a sibling and reminds us that Wright reinvented not simply American architecture, but perhaps architecture itself in the early 20th century. He understood that treating structure and space as poetic means of expression, the way a writer uses words, the way a musician uses notes, that he could create a sense of ambition and possibility and beauty in the built art of architecture that really had not been realized in exactly this form ever previously. It's distinctly American, it's distinctly modern, it's hopeful and it's ambitious, and it comes out this way because Wright had a sophisticated artistic sense of how to make space, how to make structure more sophisticated, more enveloping, more evocative of the United States, of the prairie, of architecture itself in the early 20th century. The Darwin Martin House in Buffalo is an astonishing example of this. Outside or inside, by removing walls, by stretching spaces, by creating evocative vistas to the out of doors, a remarkable environment for movement and contemplation. Wright turns architecture into a medium of expression that renews our capacity to feel joy, to feel ambition, to feel a sense of who we really want to be. And that happens in many of his works, but perhaps all of them, but certainly the Darwin Martin House is an apogee. I had a professor in college who looked at this plan, this ground plan of the Darwin Martin House as part of instruction to young architects. How do you design? How do you understand space and structure? And the professor said, this is simply a perfect architectural plan. This is the best building plan that has ever been created, and you should study it and learn from it. And there is probably no single best architectural plan. There are many, but if there were one best architectural plan, this might just be it. Why do we revere Frank Lloyd Wright? Because of the sophistication of works like this. And of course, Falling Water, where the Martin House, you know, it's on flat ground, it's prairie style architecture, it speaks to the American landscape, but Falling Water is really an intrinsic part of the American landscape. And we all know that it's on the waterfall, but here's an image that says architecture is three-dimensional, that structure evokes and enhances nature, that the stone of the mountains is the stone of the house, that the fluidity and anti-gravitational float of the water is echoed in the spaces and vistas of this house. This photograph says those things very evocatively. Many of you have been to Falling Water to have this experience, and it's another one of these things. We revere Wright in the Martin House for his abstraction. We revere Wright in Falling Water for the immediacy of nature, for the capacity of architecture to evoke nature and even enhance it. You know, Frank Lloyd Wright is a given. It's always a pleasure to remind ourselves that in his work are these great substantial themes of building, of the United States, of the landscape, and of what architecture can do. Okay, but as we think about the San Francisco office, we start to contemplate where are the places where Wright created his architecture. And on one hand, there are three of them that are the most important and really the singular places of his architectural creation. Three of them, starting with the home and studio in Oak Park, Illinois. You're looking at a complex photo, and you can see in the background, this is his actual house, begun in 1889, and then the different buildings of the home and studio were constructed over a quick course of years. It's a little bit better understood in plan. this beautiful, here's a perspective rendering, barely see the house in the background. We start to see the plan from this German publication of 1910, 1911, that was so important to Wright's career. This is a beautiful drawing. Here we see it a little better. The bookshop is a later edition, but here's the house. The drafting room, because the architectural office is a place where architects have to produce drawings for buildings. The office, because here's where Frank Lloyd Wright is going to be, and here's where an administrator is going to be. The reception area, because a client is going to come in and be received here. And the library, because maybe you will meet here, or maybe you will pick an important portfolio from the shelves here. Also, equally importantly, the little octagon, Wright is starting to experiment with architectural form, with making buildings out of the geometries that he feels are resonant of natural values, of expressive possibilities, and of architecture as a dynamic medium of expression. So a lot is happening in here. He's running an office, he's experimenting with architecture. There are test cases that he does, especially in the drafting room. There are those who say, aha, this drafting room from the 1890s is really a test run for example, Unity Temple of 1906 or so. The home and studio is a place where Wright is creating an all-encompassing environment where he shows what his values are, he tests ideas in architecture, and he welcomes potential clients to see the possibilities of what they can get from a Frank Lloyd Wright building. It's early, it's developmental, but it's a landmark and crucial to establishing those values of how he practices architecture. This is the two-story drafting room. It's, many of you are aware, in Oak Park, now open for tours, and it's a view into the future of the Unity Temple, of other multi-story Wright spaces, of the Prairie style as it develops. It's exciting to come in here and know that the young architect already had decades ahead planned for how he was going to build. Here we are at Taliesin in Spring Green, Wisconsin. Frank Lloyd Wright's biography, his life is tumultuous and not something that I'll get into in this lecture, but suffice it to say, at Taliesin in Spring Green, Wisconsin, starting in 1911 and going on through numerous building campaigns and fires and renewed building campaigns, organic architecture starts here. He has ideas of it in earlier buildings, but it's here that the stone comes from the site, that the cement and plaster use sand from the nearby river, that he's cutting down trees for wood. My joke is that part of it is because he's broke and he can't afford building materials, so he's got to get them from nearby and he's got to make them by hand. But it also reinforces his sense of organic architecture, that you use the materials at hand, you express them in ways that are honest to their texture, to their solidity, to their color, to their nature, to their durability. And you use them in ways that are consistent throughout. So stone, wood, plaster, they're always expressed similarly to their use in other parts of the building. And then what is varied and what is complex is the way that you articulate space and procession and the way you live your life in a sophisticated building. I sometimes wonder how Frank Lloyd Wright, the 5'8.5" guy, got up to these high cabinets to get out whatever was in storage. But I shouldn't let that be the only thing you notice in this complex ceiling-scape of planes and folds and passages and remarkable abstract art of the way the angled walls of stone come together. It's rich and it's expressive, and you never lose track of what the quality of the landscape is there in northern Wisconsin, what the native stone is like, what it is to have kinship with the trees and with the sand and the water of that site where his family had lived for generations. This is Taliesin. This is his home and studio, starting in 1911, as I say, and continuing through the end of his practice and the end of his life, and really on to today as a tourist site. And then, of course, the third major Wright home and studio is Taliesin West outside of Scottsdale, Arizona. He started camping out here in the 1920s. And one of my favorite stories about Wright from that time is when they came to this site and they built temporary tents and cabins for seasonal living out here, not having built a permanent structure yet. Wright was out in the desert with some disciples, with some canvas tents, some little wooden cabins, and a grand piano. How they got it out there, I don't know, but it is there on the plans from the time. It was Wright who said, "Give me the luxuries of life and I will gladly do without the necessities." And it's a great motto. But the other aspect of this is that as much as the architecture is complete divergence in some respects, it's not low-hipped roofs like Taliesin West. It's not a complex iteration of American shingle-style architecture like the home and studio. It's a rumination on how concrete and stone are echoing the sensibility of the mountains. And it's an expression of how these sort of angled box-like girders are a newly and innovatively free expression of structure and enclosure that he wanted to implement in the desert. The desert is a place where you invent. The desert is a place where space is expansive and where the structures that enclose human habitation are unusual and always present, but never entirely constricting. And it's a great adventure that takes place in Taliesin West. What do these three places have in common? They are all-encompassing iterations of Frank Lloyd Wright's vision of architecture that he invents and creates and then surrounds himself and you with this adventurous sensibility that architecture is poetic and that it's adventurous and that it is uniquely tied to its place. So very different appearances, very different colors, palettes of materials, but a very consistent sense that, you know, it's Frank Lloyd Wright's world and we're all just here visiting, which is, of course, a great pleasure. As this, I think this is one of mine. My companion and I visited Taliesin West, and that was a couple years ago, and it's still a thrilling recollection. Okay, we have these three major locations, and they're crucial to projecting Wright's values, but there are in fact other places where he conducted architecture. And the irony of this is that I'm not exactly going to show them, and you'll understand why. An early location for Wright was in Steinway Hall in Chicago. Back in the old days, Wright practiced architecture in a business office, in an office building, like a bunch of his colleagues, people like Cecil Corwin and Marion Mahoney Griffin and Dwight Perkins and some of these other people. I will agree with the argument that Frank Lloyd Wright was the greatest architect of the 20th century, but if you look at his pals from early 20th century Chicago, a number of whom had offices in Steinway Hall, you'll think, wow, that is a rogues gallery of great architects from the early 20th century, not just Wright. But they had an office building, and that's where they worked. Here's the Imperial Hotel from Tokyo, begun in the 1920s, and famously survived the earthquake of 1927. The thing about the Imperial Hotel is that Wright had a little office on the construction site. There are very, very few pictures of it. I couldn't find any on the internet. He had a little office in Tokyo where he scribbled tons and tons of small drawings for the stone carvers to make this wonderful ornament. The point here is that he had an office on the construction site. It was modest, it was very practical and functional, and that was in stark contrast to the building, which ended up being beautiful and sadly torn down in the 1960s. Wright had little modest offices on construction sites that were not much more than functional office spaces, and therefore we don't see pictures of them often. Similarly here in Los Angeles in the 1916 through 1922, if you're studying for the slide exam, this is the Barnstall House, the Aline Barnstall House, or the Hollyhock House. And Wright worked in Los Angeles during those years, built 4 remarkable houses, of which this is one of the foremost. He had a modest office in Los Angeles. He sometimes shared office space with his son, Lloyd, Frank Lloyd Wright Jr. And again, it's hard to find pictures of because he worked in a modest functional office from which he would produce these masterworks. This one, we have a bit of a photographic recollection because at Johnson Wax here in Racine, Wisconsin, built in 1936 to 1939 or so, Wright invents these lily pad columns, the dendriform columns, and he puts on a publicity stunt, piling iron very high on the top of the column to show this is very strong, it's rigid, it's lasting, it will not collapse. He has a small construction site office at the site of Johnson Wax. We don't see much of it because what we see is the publicity stunt and the beautiful building that ensued from it. But a couple of different examples here, different times in his career. He has these construction site on location functional offices. Oh, and the last and perhaps favorite among these is that when Wright was building, do I do it like this? The Guggenheim in New York, he had an office in the Plaza Hotel. He stayed there for weeks at a time. You can see the drafting board, and that was his home away from home in New York. So the idea of a field office was something that he did, but these were, of course, in the Plaza, it was fairly luxurious. And to go with the fancy armchair, there were a few Frank Lloyd Wright stools and chairs. But the seed of the idea of a field office was there, but it wasn't realized in anything like the San Francisco office until the San Francisco office came along. And just as sort of an addendum to this section of field offices, this is the Auditorium building in Chicago, Illinois. This was designed by Louis Sullivan, Adler and Sullivan in partnership. And when Frank Lloyd Wright was working for Louis Sullivan in the 1880s and 1890s, their office was up here in the tower of the Auditorium building. And he recalls that with a number of sorts of adventures in his autobiography. But one of the things about Wright is that even though he had signed a big contract, a 5-year contract to work exclusively for Louis Sullivan, one of the first things that Wright did was take an outside commission. He designed and built the Winslow House. And the story goes that Sullivan was walking down the street in the Chicago suburbs where this house was being constructed, and he saw it, and he said, darn it, there's only one architect who could have designed that house, and it's Frank Lloyd Wright, and he's not supposed to be moonlighting on me. Now, however true that story is or is not, Wright cheated on his employer, and it caused his falling out with Louis Sullivan and caused his departure from the firm. And it should stick in your mind that if Wright was jealous of architects who worked for him or distrustful of other architects who worked for him, it's because he himself was not so trustworthy. He broke his contract and did outside work that he should have brought into the office of Louis Sullivan and worked on up here. So that's something to keep in mind as we go along. Okay, so who works for Wright? There are many, and there are a lot of fascinating and distinctive characters in this tale. We're sort of setting the stage for Aaron Green, and doing so with people such as Marion Mahoney Griffin. She was the first woman to study architecture at MIT in Cambridge. She was a brilliant designer and renderer. She devised the drawing style that people attributed to Frank Lloyd Wright. We see here the Unity Temple. This isn't his drawing, this is her drawing, and it became the office style. This is a house in Grand Rapids, Michigan that is really, it's attributed to both of them. There are people, when you get into the inside baseball part of this, people will argue about, well, that's a Wright house, but really Marion Mahoney Griffin designed it. And there's a strong likelihood to that, because as much as I'm avoiding the Wright biography, it is the case, this is the period where he runs off to Europe with the wife of a client and leaves Marion Mahoney behind to finish all his work. And she goes on to spend many years in Australia as a prolific and distinguished architect. And when you look at her later work, you realize that, yes, she was an enormous talent, but her departure from Wright's office and separation from him was acrimonious, because he both admired her talent and was jealous of it and didn't really know how to treat an employee, if I can put it that way. Here's Rudolf Schindler and his crazy wisp of hair to match his crazy wisps of architecture. Schindler worked for Wright for a couple of years and ran the office when Frank Lloyd Wright was in Japan and had those Los Angeles projects to finish. And Schindler has houses and other projects all over Los Angeles and further afield. Really a brilliant talent. You know, you can argue that Wright is the greatest American architect. I will agree with that argument, but I will also agree that Rudolf Schindler is right up there. And comparing the two, when you compare Schindler and Wright, everybody comes out looking good. And Schindler's Level Beach House is here in Los Angeles, completed in 1926. It's a masterpiece of American architecture. And, you know, he and Wright had arguments over credit and, you know, Schindler was trying to get his license in the United States, and he said, oh, well, I ran Frank Lloyd Wright's office for 3 years, which is basically true. And Frank Lloyd Wright said, no, you didn't, which was false and unfair. So it was an acrimonious departure. Schindler was a great light of American architecture, and it's a shame that they parted ways on bad terms. Here's Cornelia Brierly, who lived her 99-year life as a devoted disciple of Frank Lloyd Wright. And this doesn't really help my thesis that Wright treated his employees badly, because he and Cornelia Brierly had a very positive relationship. She was from the Pittsburgh area. She joined the Taliesin Fellowship, I want to say, in the late 1930s. I'll check my notes. And she was a talented architect who designed this building, which is the Knott's or Notes House in West Mifflin. You look at this house and you say, wow, that looks like a Frank Lloyd Wright Usonian house. It is sophisticated. It is following those principles of organic architecture very rigorously. In fact, she designed this house while she was at the Taliesin Fellowship at Wright School of Architecture. And he sort of looked over her shoulder and helped out on the design. And we know that because the drawing still exists, and they say Notes House by Cornelia Brierly, architect, and then down below it says approved, FLW, on these drawings from 1938 that still exists. So she was a considerable talent. She designed buildings in his style, in her own style, in the combination, very convincingly. Shortly after this, though, Wright said, you know what, I am not so comfortable having apprentices bring in their own commissions. If you're going to be an apprentice of me, Frank Lloyd Wright, at Taliesin, you're going to do the work of Taliesin, but you're not going to bring in your own projects, because he and Cornelia had a good relationship, but he didn't want the competition, and he didn't want, you know, he wanted control over his apprentices. This is the Taliesin Fellowship, a kind of, I'll say it, an iconic picture. Wright opened the Taliesin Fellowship as a school. It came to sort of blend together a school of architecture with his architectural practice, with having people run the estate and farm that Taliesin had become, remember from the pictures we looked at in Spring Green, Wisconsin. This is from the 1930s, and these are some of the best known, most accomplished apprentices and fellows from Taliesin who worked with Wright. When I was writing my thesis, I could name every single one of them, and it's just as well that we don't have time for that. But people like William Wesley Piers, who's right here, who was Wright's chief engineer and kind of his right hand. Jack Howe is in here, who is one of Wright's foremost draftsmen and designers who went on to his own architectural career. Bob Mosher and Edgar Taffel, who worked on Falling Water at different times, Davy Davison. These include many of the most accomplished and long-term Taliesin fellows. And of course, Cornelia Brierly isn't in here, but she should be. But this is a group who were characterized by their devotion to Wright, by their staying with him and operating the Taliesin Fellowship. And it brings us to Aaron Green, because he was exemplary yet unique. He was exemplary, and I should, you all know this if you're interested enough to listen into this lecture. Here's Aaron Green at Taliesin West, sometime between 1939 and call it 1942, working hard there in the desert at his drafting table. Aaron Green came to Frank Lloyd Wright in 1939. He had graduated from Cooper Union. He had a degree in architecture, and he had a commission to build a house in Florence, Alabama, which was the town where he grew up. And he and Jeff covered this notably in his presentation, but it's worth repeating here. Aaron Green had an architecture degree. He had a client to build a house, and he said to himself, to his clients, and then to Frank Lloyd Wright, I could design this house, but it would be better if we took it to Frank Lloyd Wright. And that's exactly what they did. The Rosenblums. Here are my slides. Here's more of Aaron Green. Here he is as a mature man. Here he is in the 1950s with the rented helicopter with Frank Lloyd Wright, this classic picture that you really have to share. So Aaron Green is an architect. He spends time at the Taliesin Fellowship, as we see here. But the thing that he does that is pivotal to this unique circumstance and to our understanding of his relationship with Wright is that he says to the Rosenblums, you should hire Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright says, hey, Aaron, thanks for the commission. No architect has ever brought me a commission before. They have all tried to take commissions away. I, Frank Lloyd Wright, am going to design the Rosenblum house. You're going to help me. You're going to be site representative. You're going to oversee construction of this beautiful Usonian house. That will be a help to me, and that will be a wonderful lesson and education for you. And in the end, everyone will be thrilled with this classic Usonian house, this sophisticated but economical late 1930s, early 1940s design. I will tell you, because it's true, that I interviewed Mrs. Rosenblum on the phone in the 1990s, and I can't do the math. She was in her 80s at that point, and she was very sharp and very kind to speak to me and very attentive. And she told me the story of the design and construction of this house. And I tell you because she told me, she said, we finished that house, and when it was complete, we were delighted with it, and we moved in, and that night we conceived our first child. Okay, thank you, Mrs. Rosenblum. It shows how people are moved and thrilled and given to unusual enthusiasm over their Frank Lloyd Wright houses. And this one still exists as an artifact. I'm showing you, Aaron Green had a decades-long career. He's been the subject of an architectural monograph and a museum exhibition, and there are many, many projects. I'm just showing you the Choctaw House of 1956 because this is an Aaron Green project, and it says to me very clearly, here's an architect who absorbed Wright's lessons, who understood principles of organic architecture, who understood the creation of three-dimensional spaces to reflect particular free and ambitious kinds of lifestyles, and some very specifically Wrightian details, the coved ceiling, the sculptural shape, the three-dimensional quality of the fireplace. And perhaps more than Wright, Aaron Green had a sense of generous and flowing and luxurious space that is, I think, uniquely his own. So here's an architect in Aaron Green who understood Wright's principles and embraced them and also made them completely his own. He was a remarkable architect in that respect.
Interject for Charles, if I could please interject for just a minute.
Yeah,
We're getting
yes.
comments, and thank you very much for those watching. I would like to ask that if anybody has a question, please type in your comments and we'll try to get to the questions at the end of the presentation.
Terrific. Yes, questions and comments are welcome, and I will be eager to entertain them. Okay. I will keep going, and we're moving right along. As you think about Aaron Green, and again, Aaron Green approaches Frank Lloyd Wright in 1939 with the Rosenblum House. He works at Taliesin for a number of years. He serves in World War II. And after World War II, he decides that he's going to move to San Francisco and start his architectural practice. And that's on the cusp of 1951. It's useful to think about Wright in the 50s. He has renewed popularity during that era. He is proposing he's building many houses, and they're wonderful, and they're luxurious, and they're sophisticated. He occasionally does a larger project. The Guggenheim figures prominently, and there are other works that he builds that are fairly substantial in size. But he's proposing a mile-high skyscraper, the Illinois, because New York has overtaken Chicago as America's skyscraper city, and Frank Lloyd Wright says, "I am a visionary. I will imagine something more extraordinary and outrageous than any other architect has ever conceived." Likewise, for our own point in Pittsburgh, this is a gigantic multi-level concrete spiral that takes up the entirety of the Golden Triangle and incorporates a variety of domed structures and recreational facilities and sports arenas within the concentric circles of that concrete megastructure. It's almost less of a real project, although it's documented with some surprisingly detailed drawings, than it is a dare from Frank Lloyd Wright to Edgar Kaufman in the city of Pittsburgh or to Chicago to say, "I have bigger ideas than you have budgets. I have bigger ideas than you have imagination, and I can out-imagine, out-design even the biggest economic forces and egomaniacal ambitions of the post-war era." Here's Broadacre City. Wright starts designing it in the 1930s and has a resurgence of reconsidering it in the 1950s. He takes the American landscape and fills it with an unrolling sheet, an unrolling textile, if you will, of Wright landscapes and buildings and viaducts and towers and all sorts of components. The landscape won't be open and suburban. It will be one sprawling and continuous Frank Lloyd Wright design. That's what he's thinking about in the 1950s. And that's kind of what he's thinking about when he goes to San Francisco, when he starts thinking about San Francisco. The pivotal project here is, of course, the Bay Bridge, the butterfly wing bridge that he has proposed for San Francisco. Now, he proposes this in 1949 at the suggestion of engineer Yaroslav Polivka, who's a collaborator. Hey, Frank, why don't you propose a Bay Area crossing? And he says effectively, "That's a great idea. I'm glad I thought of it. I'm working with reinforced concrete at the Guggenheim. I've mastered it at Fallingwater. What better material for a South Bay crossing than reinforced concrete?" He designs it, but it's really Aaron Green who publicizes it, who gets it in newspapers, who gets it on TV, who gets it into museum exhibitions. Jan Novi, Aaron Green's longtime associate, tells us that this particular rendering is done by Aaron Green. And it's just one of those reminders that Green was an architectural talent and that Wright was dependent on his very talented junior associates to complete the vision of these projects and to complete the documentation of them. So when Aaron Green in 1951 says to Frank Lloyd Wright, I'm going to San Francisco, that's when Frank Lloyd Wright says, that's great, Aaron. While you're opening an office, why don't you open one for me too? And we can share this office. You can do your work and you can help with my work. Again, this is something that Jeff talks about, but it's like the founding, it's not a legend because it's true and it's well documented, but this sort of founding exchange of the San Francisco office. Aaron Green goes to San Francisco. Frank Lloyd Wright says, hey, you and I can cooperate. We can share an office. And what he doesn't say, but what is implicit is, I trust you to promote my work. I trust you not to steal commissions from me. If you want to do your own work, that's fine, because we have a trusting relationship that is unique in really relationships with Frank Lloyd Wright and his apprentices or his co-workers or whatever you want to call them. And it takes place in this 1950s atmosphere when Wright is searching for large projects. And that sense of potential is there everywhere you look. The V.C. Morris gift shop is in San Francisco, and it was just at completion when Aaron Green goes to San Francisco to open this office. And he helps out with sort of keeping an eye on it and being sure that it's finished properly, and talking to the Morrises about the potential for other commissions that don't get realized. But of course, the V.C. Morris gift shop is this little brick cube that inside has the spiraling ramp as a gallery space, and it is a test run for the Guggenheim Museum. The Guggenheim was started, the design, in 1943, but not finished, of course, until 1959. And it took it wasn't until really they cleared the site in 1953. They start construction in earnest in 1956, if I remember correctly. So Frank Lloyd Wright is champing at the bit to build a ramp and do some of the test architecture and construction. And that's what the V.C. Morris gift shop is. Talking about San Francisco and potential, he knows that the bigger project is coming and he wants to test it with something smaller in advance of the larger project. And that's what happens here. The Walker House in Carmel, California, Aaron Green does a lot of work on this, and it is contentious and troubled at the time, but it ends up being a beautiful and favored Wright house from the 1950s in Clint Eastwood's hometown. So that brings us to the San Francisco office. And again, Jeff Kidder is the, I don't even know what words to use, but his capacity as an architect to reconstruct this, to cultivate relationships with people such as Jan Novi, to get the history of it, to bring in historic objects. And he's talked about this story in great detail. So I don't want to recapitulate that, but there are just key elements that are important here. Having talked about Wright has his homes and studios, and then he has his nondescript construction offices. This is a place that combines those two things, because Wright doesn't live here. It's not, he didn't design the building. This is an interior. That is, he didn't design the surrounding building. He certainly designed the office itself. But this is a combination of it's not a home and studio, but it is an encompassing example of Wright's architecture. When you look at the residences and the other projects that he's designed, when you think about the way he sculpts space and uses procession and uses transparency to give a sense of architectural depth and architectural adventure, all of those qualities are present here in a compact space that is nonetheless very articulate and very substantial and very, as I say, very evocative of the substance and ambition of Wright's work. And as I say, it's the combination of those things. It's the substance of a home and studio, and it's the functionality of a field office. And you can see here with the drafting tables, the functionality, the stools, the books, the varied ceiling heights, the 120-degree geometry, which is present in so many Wright projects of this era, bringing all of those things together. This is the Fawcett House from around 1956. This is a project that was built under the care and auspices of the San Francisco office. And there it is. It's the 120-degree geometry. It's the varying roof and bulkhead heights. And it's that sense that you sample Wright's architecture in the office, and then you can experience it as a built project. And the larger project is hinted at in that small office, just in the same way it was in the Oak Park studio of the 1890s. So it culminates in Marin County. It's terrific that the Marin County Civic Center was Wright's largest public commission, and that it's to this day, it's sprawling, but it's also singularly Wrightian and sophisticated and evocative of the landscape of his organic architecture. But it also fits into that 1950s sensibility that, given a chance, Wright has ideas and concepts and innovations that can be executed through a very large project. And it wasn't that he lacked the ambition or the vision, it was that until Aaron Green came along, he didn't have the right relationship with his associates to make projects of this size happen. So we can look at the San Francisco office and say, aha, that is a deliciously condensed yet articulate sampling of Wright's ideas and views and visions of organic architecture. But we can also see in the Marin County Civic Center that with this relationship with Aaron Green, whom he trusted, and Aaron Green, who was so very talented, that this very large project could come into being and realize the visions that Wright had through the 1950s. I wrote my thesis on this in 1996, and in the process of doing this, I have clarified it in ways just recently that are very satisfactory. Pardon me for reading this, but it came to me with clarity as I was working on this. In Wright's career, other architects were either devoted disciples or untrustworthy competitors. Architectural offices were either exhibits of creative brilliance or undistinguished business offices. Aaron Green uniquely managed to take the opposites and unify them. The key was that he was a talented architect who brought Wright a commission instead of taking them away. So he became a practicing architect who was trustworthy, not competitive, and a disciple who could do his own work and not simply be under the master's thumb. Similarly, the San Francisco office was a business outpost, but it incorporated more than enough Wright's design panache so that it could evoke the brilliance of his practice. So those are the conclusions, and I'll do the postscript quickly since we're shorter on time. The Pope Leahy house was built in the 1930s. It's a beautiful Usonian house. It was actually moved in the Virginia suburbs to avoid being destroyed for new construction. Frank Lloyd Wright houses might be very attached to their site, but it might also be feasible to move them. In Polymath Park, the Duncan House from Lisle, Illinois has moved to Western Pennsylvania, as has the Lindholm House from Minnesota, now in Western Pennsylvania. These Wright houses have been disassembled and moved. So, and in fact, when Olgivanna Lloyd Wright, Wright's spouse, passed away in 1985, she wanted him to be buried with her at Taliesin West. So they dug him up out of Wisconsin, believe it or not, and replanted him in Arizona, where he rests to this day. But I would argue via aphorism that Frank Lloyd Wright moves us, sometimes we move him. So thank you, and I'll happily take questions.
Well, Charles, that was great. A very keen insight, and what brought us to the San Francisco office. And the previous talk, if you who are listening haven't seen it, it's on our YouTube channel. It talks about the San Francisco office coming from San Francisco through Pittsburgh and a couple other stops to finally land permanently in Erie. So a couple of quick questions to start with. You mentioned a number of unbuilt Wright structures. Which unbuilt Wright structure would you most like to see completed?
There are a bunch of them. There was an apartment building designed for Pittsburgh on Mount Washington up on the top of the hill. And there's a building there that is loosely inspired by it, but I would love to see as close as possible a construction of Frank Lloyd Wright's design for Mount Washington in Pittsburgh. I would love to see that for Pittsburgh. And maybe the runner-up or the two finalists, he designed a life insurance building for Chicago in the 1920s that was going to have a smooth glass and copper skin and be this sort of block filling building with four kind of narrow wings. And it would have been just a stunning high rise in copper and glass, and drawings of it exist, but I would love to see that built. So either of those two, or both, the Pittsburgh apartment building exactly as designed, or the Chicago high-rise insurance building from the 1920s.
Here's one. You mentioned some Wright buildings that have been torn down, especially you mentioned the hotel in Tokyo.
Yeah.
Of all the buildings of his that are no longer standing, is that the most outstanding one, or did we also lose other great projects?
We have lost others, and I think the Imperial Hotel was singular because of its size, and also there's was a culture in Japanese construction at the time, and I don't know if it continues or not, 100 years later, but there were very talented stone carvers in great numbers, and there was this kind of uniquely soft volcanic stone, and Wright would produce these quick sketch drawings and hand them off to stone carvers who could understand the drawings well enough to make ornamental sculpture very quickly. So there was just an enormous profusion of ornamental sculpture in this building that had unusual structure and complex spaces and all these things. So I think the Imperial Hotel is the greatest loss. Certainly the Larkin Building in Buffalo, I want to say it was torn down in the 1940s or 50s. That was Wright's great masterpiece from the first decade of the 20th century, and that is a terrible loss also. There are many that have been lost. I'd say those are probably the two foremost because of their size and sophistication.
If the Larkin Building was torn down during Wright's lifetime, did he comment on that? Was he? Yeah,
he was very disappointed, and he said that it was very sturdily built, which was not always the case for his buildings, but it was very sturdily built and therefore very costly to tear down, and he took sort of bitter satisfaction in how it was harder to tear down than they expected.
You mentioned several Wright offices, of course, his home and studio in Chicago, Taliesin and Taliesin West, and the fourth permanent office, at least until he passed away, was in San Francisco. I know there was an office also for several years in LA. Was there another city that would have benefited from an additional Wright office? I know he worked out of some buildings, the Plaza Hotel. I did not know that one. That surprised me. But would we have benefited had he planted more offices?
Well, I think that, it's the Aaron Green principle. I think that for those to have worked optimally, he would have needed additional people whom he trusted, like Green, and who had Aaron Green's talent, and so that strikes as a missing ingredient. But in terms of they built a version of the Monona Civic Center after his lifetime, and it's like, oh, maybe he should have had a Minneapolis office, or I always think of Pittsburgh and the relationship with the Kaufmans, and maybe if he had a more established footprint, maybe that apartment building would have been built, and maybe a couple more people would have come to him for residential commissions. So it's I think anywhere where he had unbuilt projects, it's like, what if there were more Aaron Greens? What if there were more people on the ground who could be trusted to have a good relationship with him, which was the big challenge. I think of Pittsburgh, I think of Minneapolis. I would have liked to see more. There's a part of me that would have liked to see more Wright buildings in Los Angeles. There's a part of me that thinks, oh, we have Wright buildings in Los Angeles. They're just by Lloyd Wright and Rudolph Schindler. So, but I say Pittsburgh and Minneapolis for more Wright offices in my imagination.
You mentioned some of the difficulties that Wright had with his apprentices, people who he was associated with that, he felt he couldn't trust as far as commissions. He also, of course, as you mentioned, had his own problems when he was apprenticed or working for another firm. So do you see this as part of just the basic Wright personality, being a great architect and great thinker, or do you think it's something more endemic with the type of business that he had?
That's a good question. Well considered. I think that it gets to the specifics of his personality, because there are architects who run very large practices, and that by necessity means handing responsibility off to other people. The huge firm Gensler, and of course Art Gensler passed away a couple of years ago, but a year or two ago, that firm is one of the largest in the world and many offices in many cities. They have a reputation for commercial and institutional work of high quality, not as much of a singular design signature, but it shows that having a large firm under, one person's founding control is very possible. I think there are, more contemporary offices to consider, but I think of somebody like Michael Graves, who had a very distinctive design style, but managed to produce an enormous amount of work by having lieutenants who could understand the style and either perpetuate his work or conceive of works that were very similar to what he would do, that could be, that could go out under his signature. It's possible to have trusted lieutenants. It's possible to have bunches of people in remote locations. I think Wright was as much a volatile personality and enjoy, I don't take satisfaction in saying, oh, Wright really had a personality cult. I don't know if that's a fair characterization, but people say it with some frequency, that it was an organization that played to his personality and was not so much a conventional business. And I think Aaron Green was able to navigate that and act like a more conventional business architect who could do that kind of work. But yeah, it was a lot of it. A lot of the problem was Wright's personality and his inability to maintain positive business relationships with people who had talents approaching his own.
And I think I have one last question here from the audience.
Sure.
Is there anything, I believe it should be left of the Frank Lloyd Wright design office in the S&A Auditorium building in Chicago?
Is there anything remaining of it?
Right.
That's a question for Jeff Kidder, and I'll thank Jeff again and really continue to praise his efforts in shepherding this project and reconstructing it meticulously. My understanding from Jeff is that he has really combed through the finest of details to get everything assembled, to work with Jan Novi, who was the successor and still is the successor to Aaron Green. There are archival materials, papers, things of that sort that are still out in California. But in terms of every stick of wood, every nail that could be recovered, the literal nuts and bolts, my understanding is that's been done really as thoroughly as humanly possible. And Jeff Kidder and his team are the experts on that. And I hold their work in enormously high regard, and Jeff and his team can answer that question in any more detail. Actually,
I think perhaps I didn't make the question clear enough. I believe the question was about the office that was in the tower in Chicago.
Oh, in Chicago.
Yeah.
That's a good question. The Chicago Auditorium building stands. And it's funny, oh gosh, it's been years since I've been there, although I have been to the building. I have not been up in that tower. I don't know the specifics. I bet you $1 that at some point the Sullivan office moved out. And in the early 1900s, when that happened, people weren't concerned about saving the Adler and Sullivan office with museum-like care. They were concerned with getting another rented space client in there. So the building exists. Probably the interior materials are long gone, and the Sullivan scholars and archives can answer that in more detail.
Well, I think that's it for the questions. Hang on just a second. Well, I'll just read the last comment that just popped in. Frank Lloyd Wright certainly had a knack for spotting and engaging good talent, great presentation, lots of insight.
Well, thank you. I agree with the thesis, and I'm grateful for the kind words. And as I say, I'm grateful for this opportunity. It's been enjoyable, and I hope I've spread a little knowledge and a lot of enthusiasm.
Thank you very much again. This is George Deitch from the Hagen History Center. Stop by at our office at our campus at 356 West 6th Street, and please take a look at the spectacularly reconstructed office of Frank Lloyd Wright and Aaron Green in our newest exhibit building. Good night.
Good night. Thanks so much.